Welcome to the NintenFusion podcast, a podcast that fuses past, present, and future Nintendo thought. I'm David, accompanied by my friend Jordan. Now, Jordan, I think they need to stop calling it the Zelda franchise. It should be called the Zelda chain. Why do you think that is?
Does that have something to do with time?
No, it doesn't have something to do with time. It's because there's so many links.
Oh no. I'm not too good at these puns yet.
No, you're getting there. Sometimes I think you just think a little too analytically about these jokes. Like there's got to be a logical explanation for this or something. But speaking of Zelda, our topic this week is going to be about the Minish Cap. We've been promising this for what, 2 episodes now? 3 episodes?
Yeah, and on top of that, we had planned to do this the week after Minish Cap came out, but we kept delaying it. The game's longer than I expected it to be.
Yeah, it's actually fairly long for a Game Boy Advance game. I mean, honestly, in terms of like gameplay hours, it's probably on par with Mario and Luigi Superstar Saga, which is kind of fun because that game honestly is much longer than you'd expect it to be too. I don't know if you've played that one though.
I have not.
Okay, well then ignore that. But you've played Minish Cap long enough to know exactly how long it is. Minish Cap was released on the Nintendo Switch Online service, though you do need the expansion pass for it. And it's on the Game Boy Advance collection of games. But speaking of the collection of games, I think just last week we got Metroid Fusion, right?
Yes.
So
and I'm excited to play through that for a future episode as well.
Yeah, probably not on our next one, since we'll have just done Minish Cap this week. But I think we'll definitely talk about it because we have our fair share of Metroid only episodes. Anyway, why don't we go ahead and hop right into our discussion on the Minish Cap then?
All right. I think the first thing to talk about with the Minish Cap are kind of like its mechanics that differentiate it from the rest of this franchise, right? I guess we could go into a bit of history of it. It was not made by Nintendo. It was made by Capcom. It was technically the third game Capcom made for Zelda, right? If you count both the Oracle games as separate games. Yes.
I believe that's correct. They didn't make Link's Awakening, did they?
No. Nintendo made that one.
That's right.
So yeah, this is the first time Nintendo gave the Zelda property to someone other than Philips. So that says a lot of trust for, well, I guess this is technically the second time, but Capcom was the second studio after Philips to work on Zelda. So Nintendo had a bit of confidence in Capcom, considering the last venture.
Yeah. And it was developed by Capcom's flagship studio, I believe. They did oversee development, which is quite nice. But this was clear back in 2004, which is ages ago in video games. But it's really kind of fun because it also won the 2005 Game Boy Advance Game of the Year. But we didn't see any re-release of it until the Wii U Virtual Console in 2014.
Yeah, and what was pretty significant was this felt like a full-on 2D Zelda game. Link's Awakening and the Oracle games are great and all, but they feel much more limited in scope compared to Link's the Past. And this is the first 2D Zelda game that kind of approached the same scope as Link to the Past. It still didn't quite meet the scope of Link to the Past.
No, it doesn't have nearly as many dungeons, but right. I'd say the overworld is a bit better. It's a bit larger as well than the previous entries.
Yeah. And you could definitely tell the time period it came out because it has so many sound effects from Majora's Mask and Wind Waker, which were right before it.
Right.
It even has character kind of grunts and everything. So
well, and some of the sprite art is definitely based off of Wind Waker characters.
Yeah. So it definitely at the time felt like a modern Zelda. And it was handheld. So by the time this game came out, the Oracle games felt pretty old in comparison.
Well, they look old in comparison too.
Yeah.
It's amazing how going up to, I think the Game Boy Advance was 240p or something like that. Just like doubling the amount of pixels on both axes just completely shifted how cool they could make the games look. And Minish Cap looks really wonderful, I think. They did an awesome job with all of the sprite art, and the worlds look really pretty. And there's some really interesting like effects in the overworld as well. Like the water is actually kind of shiny, and things sway in the breeze, and it's really quite impressive for pixel art based stuff. We definitely didn't see this with A Link to the Past, and definitely not on the Game Boy Color and Game Boy itself.
Yeah, it definitely, like, up to that point is the prettiest 2D Zelda game.
Yeah, absolutely. But kind of talking a little bit about some of the gameplay mechanics that set it apart, besides it just being a bit more of an ambitious 2D game on handheld, the main gimmick in the game is being able to shrink down into the size of the Minish characters, or Minish race, I guess we should call them, in the Zelda universe. And it's really quite cool. You meet a creature that looks surprisingly similar to all of Link's caps that he's had throughout the entire series. And he talks, and his name is Eslo, and he's like, hey, I can show you a neat trick. Go stand on that stump and you can shrink down into a tiny little boy and go explore the world of the Minish. And that essentially like makes so many areas in the overworld just so much larger for exploration.
Yeah, it gives a lot of depth to the exploration of the world. Not only does it give another dynamic when you're small in like the previous or the main area that you explore, but it also allows you to like find nooks and crannies of different areas to then be expanded into larger exploratory zones, right?
Right. There are like homes all over the map for some of the Minish that you can run into. And even some of the cracks or small areas end up becoming essentially mini dungeons, with lots of individual secrets and stuff. And it's just a really nice way to take what I would say is the limited map size that the Game Boy Advance allowed and just make it so much more fleshed out.
Yeah. Like the world feels a lot larger than it actually is.
Yeah. And it is not very large. If you like look at the tile sizes for each of the map areas, it's really not that big. But by combining the Minish mechanic with all of the different designs and puzzle solving, you definitely get a much more fleshed out, interesting, and larger adventure.
Yeah. And I think they utilize the puzzle, or they utilize the shrink mechanic for puzzles pretty well. A lot of the dungeons, especially in the early sections of the game, were pretty heavily focused on like trying to figure out how to maneuver yourself so that you could get to a different part of the dungeon, whether that's through being small or large, and like a bunch of the rooms would like change their mechanic. Well, not change their mechanics, but their dynamics, right?
Yeah.
Of how large you were.
Yeah, and I think it's really quite fun. The Zelda series hasn't had a gimmick quite like it since. Most of the other gimmicks that have come up in 3D games afterwards, I mean, we've never really had the shrink mechanic, but Twilight Princess's whole gimmick was switching between being a wolf and being a human, but you were essentially the same size. You just had a different skill set. When it comes to being Minish, if you're not on the overworld screen as a tiny little Link, you have all of your full abilities. You're just smaller and in rooms that are designed and look like you're tiny. And it's just a nice touch, especially that they took care to make some of these regions actually look really interesting.
Yeah, there is a part of me that kind of wishes that you could transform back and forth at will.
Yeah.
I know that would break a lot of puzzles.
Yeah, absolutely.
They'd have to redesign a lot of different things, and they probably wouldn't get quite the same results out of their puzzles. But there are a lot of areas where it just kind of sucks having to go back and forth between the shrink spot.
Yeah, I think that Twilight Princess definitely handled the transformation type gimmick way better. Because Twilight Princess, it was like, oh, you can transform into a wolf, but only after a certain point in the game. Before then, you're kind of railroaded into which form you are. And then afterwards, you can switch at will. Though the menuing is quite clunky on the GameCube and Wii version. And still somewhat clunky on Wii U unless you have the gamepad.
Well, speaking of controls, oh boy.
This game suffers from being on the Game Boy Advance. That's my best summary for it.
This game definitely made me wish that the Game Boy Advance had 4 buttons. I don't know why the Game Boy Advance doesn't have 4 face buttons.
Who knows?
But even then, even with like limitations, they did not utilize the buttons that they did have very well.
Yeah. I mean, like the L or the R button ends up becoming the A button in a lot of circumstances, but you could still use the A button in a lot of circumstances as well. And you were just locked into the old Game Boy Color mode of equipping 2 different things to your A and B buttons. And I think that that's really clunky, and it's definitely a very old style of menuing. I think that this era, especially right before the Game Boy Advance, struggles from poor menu design. The Ocarina of Time suffers from a very similar problem, which is why everyone hates the water temple, is because you have to open the super slow menu to just turn on and off your boots. In the Minish Cap, you're often having to swap around various items to solve different puzzles. And you can't have your sword equipped to a constant button all the time. So if you want to fight something with your sword, but you don't have it equipped, you have to go back to it. And that's pretty clunky and honestly not great.
Yeah. If I were to fix the buttons, what I would do is I would move. So L would become like your role, your interact with people, and also interact with the shrink mechanic when you're in that zone. I would move talking to Ezio just on the menu. You have to press start and go to talk to him or whatever. Make R the dedicated button for items. So whatever item you switch into. And then have A and B be your sword and shield, start being your start menu, and select being opening straight to your map.
I think that could work. Yeah. Though I will say there are points where you don't want both your sword and shield, and you instead want 2 of the dungeon items for faster puzzle solving. I don't have any examples off the top of my head right now.
Yeah.
So maybe the A button is your sword, and then you can swap the B and L buttons for different items. And most of the time you'll have your shield on one of them.
Okay. Yeah. Yeah. And like the reason why, well, yeah, they do have a bunch of areas where they utilize a lot of the items. Which is one thing I really liked about this game is that it tries really hard to make it so the items aren't specific to just that dungeon.
Wait. They actually did that in a Zelda game, Jordan?
Yeah. You use most of the items throughout the entire game.
Yeah, it's very good. It's definitely not like Twilight Princess.
Yeah. Now, to be fair, a lot of the items are pretty basic to be able to do that. But I think the item that you use the least is probably the cane sword, or the cane, where you can like flip things. I had completely forgotten about the cane up until the final boss, where you just randomly have to use it, and it gives no indication that that's what you're supposed to do.
Yeah. I think that there's a bit of a problem with indicating what you're supposed to use when in that fight too.
But yeah, you use pretty much all of them. I don't like the lantern. Oh man, the lantern is one of the worst items in Zelda. Just because I hate how it has to be dedicated to one of my 2 button slots, right?
Yeah.
It feels like something that should have just been, once you get it, then it's on you at all times. And it just, all the item does is just increase your visibility in dark areas.
Absolutely. I mean, that's what games like Hollow Knight have done in more recent years. You get that item and it's just a permanent upgrade, basically, for that.
And then walking into things that are flammable or whatever, you can then catch them on fire or something.
Or slash your sword to catch them on fire. I don't know.
Yeah, because there's the only instance where, aside from like lighting lanterns, that you actually want to use it is when you want to burn Gibdos. But the range is so short, it's completely useless.
Yeah. Yeah, it's really bad for that reason.
And then on top of that, when you use it, In order to use it again, you then have to turn it off to then use it again. So if you miss, it's the Gibdo is getting you.
Yeah, you're wasting more button presses to get it to light on fire. Yeah, no, it's not intuitive and it's not fluid. It's like if it's on, I should be able to just swing it as if I'm trying to catch things on fire.
Yeah,
if that's how you want the item to be used.
So implementation of the lamp, I think that's the worst item in the game by far. Like it doesn't even come close.
Yeah, it's pretty bad. But I think most of the other items are pretty solid. I honestly, like, I know it's a little cliche because it's like the first item you get, but I really love do they call it the gust bellows in this game, or is that the way that thing that they call it in Skyward Sword?
Yeah, this is by far my favorite Zelda item. And then it returns in Skyward Sword and is even better there. But yeah, this is the first time we got the gust bellow, right?
Yes.
I don't know what they call it in this game. I know.
Wind jar? I don't know.
Probably. They also utilized it to its best potential in the dungeon that you get it.
Did I say gust jar or did I say wind jar? Because it's
you said
gust
gust
jar.
bellow.
Oh, well, it's gust jar. That's what it is in this game. Anyway, sorry to interrupt.
That was an item that was utilized to its fullest in the dungeon it was in, but it still was used every now and then to like drag mushrooms towards you to then leap across bridges and stuff. It also allowed you to like uncover paths. There was one in I think it was Dark Hyrule Castle. It was either Dark Hyrule Castle or the Wind Temple or the Wind Palace. Where you suck up a bomb and then quickly move over to a different part of the room and then shoot the bomb as a projectile to blow up a wall. That was pretty fun.
Yeah.
So good use.
I think there's some really good synergy for sure in these items. And it's kind of funny because some of these items make their return in Skyward Sword. Like the mole mitts. Like, why did those come back in Skyward Sword like the gust jar did?
Skyward Sword oddly has a lot of like DNA with Minish Cap, which is interesting because they both declare themselves to be prequels to the Zelda series. Like this one's supposed to be where Link gets his hat, and then Skyward Sword is supposed to be like the first one in the timeline. But for some reason, Skyward Sword, he has a hat already.
Yeah. And the Skyward Sword game is nothing about the Minish Blade or the Four Sword.
Yeah. So I guess Skyward Sword retroactively made it so this game isn't about where Link got his hat. This specific iteration of Link just got his hat here, I guess.
This iteration of Link solidified it. In Skyward Sword, it was just his uniform. I don't know. Everyone was wearing hats like that in Skyward Sword, right?
Yeah, in Skyward Sword they had to explain where the garb comes from or whatever.
Yeah, well, yeah, this tunic, yeah, Link only wears it because it was part of the dress code for the academy and for the knights or whatever they call themselves.
Yeah, they did not need to explain it in Skyward Sword, and they kind of just stole some of Minish Cap's thunder by doing so. But maybe Skyward Sword should have just had the cap gone for continuity's sake.
Or have him wear a different hat. I don't know.
Yeah.
Have him wear a bowler cap. That'd be hilarious.
A fedora.
Yeah, but anyway, I think there are a lot of really fun items in the game too. Like, I've always really enjoyed using Rock's Cape, even though it's a little finicky in some places. Just being able to leap up and soar across. I'm pretty sure Rock's Cape is from other games as well. I always forget.
So it's usually Rock's Feather, and with the difference between Rock's Feather and the Cape is that the Cape allows you to soar. So if you hold jump button, you can soar. Whereas with just the Rock's Feather, all you can do is jump.
Yes, that's correct. Because Rock's Cape was also in regular Four Swords, which came before Minish Cap, I believe, and also in Oracle of Seasons.
Yeah, did Capcom do the other two Four Sword games as well? That would make sense.
I think so.
So Capcom actually did a lot of Zelda games.
Yeah, I'm just double checking the developer here. Yeah, Capcom made Four Swords. Capcom brought Link to the Past to the Game Boy Advance with Four Swords in 2002.
I guess that explains why the Four Sword is in this game.
They needed some sort of origin story for the Four Sword.
I guess so. I wish they didn't. I hate the Four Sword so much in this game.
Well, that's another mechanic to talk about, right? It's another item.
Yeah, so they have a second gimmick, which is the Four Sword. Basically, as you progress through the game, you are able to summon more and more links depending on how far in the game you are by like holding your sword and then walking over specific colored pads to have like an image of Link appear. And if anything touches it, it disappears. And on top of that, it extends your heart box to that as well. So like if it gets hit, then you take damage. I hate this mechanic so much.
Yeah, I think it's pretty bad. And it's kind of a shame because I actually was introduced to the Four Sword like mechanic through Four Swords Adventures. I actually played that one first. And that game does it way better.
Yeah,
I do too.
It's fun. And the reason why is because you can like create formations and you don't lose them immediately. But most importantly, you don't have to spend like 10 seconds in a loading screen waiting for your links to be summoned. Yeah,
charging up that super obnoxious bar.
Oh, just why? Waiting. Why does it need it? First, you have to charge to like being able to do like a whirlwind slash whatever, and then it starts to charge for the bar, and that takes so long, especially since for some reason they didn't just designate this just to puzzles or whatever. At the end of the game, they're like, oh, let's start putting it in combat situations. Let's make bosses around this. And it's like, okay, why are you making me sit and wait then for this to charge while the boss is effectively shooting, at some cases, almost like bullet hell scenarios?
Yeah, it's super obnoxious. And it's also weird. Like, you have Four Swords Adventures, which I believe Capcom also made.
Yeah, we just...
I'm sorry, Four Swords Adventures, not Four Swords.
Oh, okay.
No. Four Swords Adventure was made by Nintendo EAD. And that's probably why it's better. They implemented it better. But like, you have those links permanently, like you were saying. And so it's like, Nintendo just took that idea and made it better. Anyway. But I totally agree with you. The Four Sword could have been implemented so much better. Nintendo saw the potential and made Four Swords Adventures and were like, here, this is how it should be done, Capcom.
Yeah. Although there were like some good puzzle designs with the Four Sword mechanic, most of them being like you have to like navigate through a set of pillars while trying to maintain like all of your links from disappearing to get to the other side of a room to then hit all the switches. Those could be fun. Like from a puzzle standpoint, it was all right to show up every now and then. But man, the end of the game, just that became the main mechanic. You stopped shrinking at the end of the game. It's all just Four Sword crap.
Well, you went through so much trouble going through all the dungeons to get the elements. They have to reward you with those types of puzzles instead of getting small. Because, the game is suddenly not about the Minish Cap. It's about the Four Sword.
The worst ones were when you had to like deflect bullets with your sword, and you had to deflect with all the links at the same time. And if one link missed, you lost all your links and had to charge your blade again to get your links again to try again. Yeah,
it's honestly pretty obnoxious. I think that mechanic has not aged very well.
Yeah. I will say, so I just beat the game like 10 minutes before recording this podcast. The ending of the game kind of soured my mouth. So if I seem overly negative, it's just because the ending of the game kind of like really frustrated me. I'm trying to like not let that prevent me from praising, because I really did enjoy the first half of the game. You can kind of like map my enjoyment of the game based off of how many links I've unlocked for the Four Sword mechanic.
So you're saying they shouldn't have made the Four Sword at all?
I think the game would have been perfectly fine without the Four Sword. Just power up the sword like it is in every other Zelda game.
I think that would have worked really well too. And to be honest, like I didn't finish Dark Hyrule Castle. I was working through it, and then I was just suddenly reminded of high school me being like, oh yeah, no, he gave up on it too.
Yeah, so. Dark Hyrule Castle. We'll talk about that soon or later on when we go through all the levels. But
yeah,
that dungeon has some serious issues. It feels like they had a lot of ideas and they were coming close to the end of their development cycle, and they just kind of threw everything at the screen and
without real refinement. But yeah, we'll talk about that in a moment. I guess moving away from the Four Sword mechanic now that we've both berated it, even though I think it's a cool idea. And as we've said, Four Swords Adventure does it better. So if you really like that mechanic in Minish Cap, try to get your hands on a copy of the GameCube game, but good luck because it's a GameCube game.
Well, not only that, you need also Game Boy Advances, multiple Game Boy Advances, and
well, that's only if you
ports.
want to play with your friends. You can actually play through the entire game with just a GameCube controller.
Yeah, you can. Although I will say the game is significantly less fun.
Yeah, it's way more fun when you play it with people. But I played through the whole thing the first time by myself, so you're not going to sour that experience for me, Jordan.
I played through it all on my own too. It's perfectly playable on your own. It's also a good party game if you have the opportunity to play it as a party game.
Yep. So your barrier to entry is just buying the disc, making sure you have a GameCube, buying 4 Game Boy Advances, and buying 4 Game Boy Advance to GameCube adapters.
Yeah,
That's all you need.
that's all. That's it.
I think
$500.
Yeah. I think that game would work so well on Switch, just to be able to play it with your friends.
Yeah, I mean they ported Four Swords to the 3DS specifically because like it was finally an opportunity for people to have the ability to play that game.
Yeah, yeah. That was part of the 25th anniversary too.
Yeah, it would be really cool
fun.
if they did the same thing with Four Swords Adventure, because as is, it's kind of lost to time for a large amount of people.
Yeah, I mean, I'm glad I have my copy of it, but anyway, we're not here to talk about Four Swords Adventures, though. Maybe one day we should, because it's a fun game.
Yeah.
But kind of moving away from that, just kind of briefly talking about the overworld itself, right? Like the design of the overworld. I think it's fine. I think it's a fun representation of early Hyrule, since, the game tries to be at the beginning of the timeline. Well, as far beginning compared to Skyward Sword now. Who knows where the Zelda timeline actually fits things across its thousands and thousands of years of no societal progress or whatever. But anyway, it's definitely different from Link to the Past, which I think is good. But I will say that I think the progression through the overworld is a little bit too much like Zelda formulaic. You go to the forest, then you go to the mountains, then you go to ruins, then you go to a graveyard. Like, those are all locations we've explored and experienced in like almost every Zelda game. And at that point, it's like, even for Minish Cap, thinking about the games before that, could there have been something else that they could have explored? I think so. But they did give us the Palace of Winds, which was somewhat different.
Yeah, the Palace of Winds is their one like original idea up to that point. Although Tears of the Kingdoms is going to be taking that away, it seems.
Yeah. A lot more ruins for us to explore, baby.
I guess technically Skyward Sword took that away too. Was Skyward Sword just like Nintendo saying, let's make 3D Minish Cap?
I mean, in a lot of ways, yeah. Instead of like shrinking down, you just go down to the surface.
Yeah.
Anyway, besides that, I think the overworld is good. We talked already about how it's very tightly designed and there's a lot to do, especially with the Minish mechanic, the shrinking mechanic, I mean. And I don't have any major complaints about it. I guess if I had one complaint, it would be that there are loading screens in between chunks of the map, but that's honestly a limitation of the Game Boy Advance, and I can look past that.
Yeah, well, I mean, it was just kind of like a flash of a black screen. It's not much of a load screen.
Right, but it was still the transition.
Yeah.
But at least that transition wasn't nearly as bad as like Link's Awakening, where you have to do that for every 16 tiles of the map or something.
Yeah. I felt like they utilized space pretty well, and they had some pretty good puzzles in the overworld to get to certain items. Also, like good like motivations for future backtracking. And since the whole map is so condensed, it kind of has that like theme park feel to it that a lot of like older games did with smaller maps, where like you're kind of walking past attractions or whatever. And like, I'll go back and see that later, and then walk 10 steps to this other attraction, and then walk 10 steps back to the attraction when you have the correct thing to like get into there. I don't know.
Yeah. But yeah, no, I think it's totally fine. And it does a pretty good job at not opening up too much too quickly, right? Like there are those barriers, like you were saying, very specifically designed to make sure that you're on the right track. Because if I do have a little bit of a complaint, it's always the Game Boy Advance map systems that you have, they're not very clear compared to maps that we get of modern games.
No, it was also kind of annoying that you had to like open up your menu and then go over a screen and then like try and figure out what you were trying to look for.
Yeah.
Especially since like normally it would be that bad of an issue. But the fact that I had to open my menu every 10 seconds to switch items already, it's kind of frustrating that when you open up your menu, it's like, oh, I'm on the wrong screen now.
Yeah. Again, that lends itself to controls and just poor menu design from the 2000s. So, but anyway, I think that it's a really charming overworld, and I really like Hyrule Town in the middle. I think it's a really nice condensed version of a town with lots to do and honestly a pretty good hub area. I also think that it's really fun going through the festival at the very beginning of the game with Zelda just running from attraction to attraction. I think that that's very cute.
Yeah.
It feels really lived in, which is really nice. There are lots of like residential portions all over the map. You run into little Minish homes pretty much everywhere, and there are lots of things and characters to do. And I just think that it's really well designed in that way.
Yeah. And then on top of that, like the world opens up a lot more when you have the ability to shrink.
Yeah.
Hyrule Town just felt like it was constantly evolving in a way every time you return. And
a lot of like the, mini quests or side quests, mini quests because we shrink down like we're Minish. A lot of side quests even lead to the town evolving somewhat. Like different events will happen, which honestly made it feel a lot like Clock Town in Termina. I don't think we've had really a hub world that had all of that type of evolving stuff happen since Majora's Mask. So I think they took a lot of really great ideas from that game to make this town feel more lived in as well.
Speaking of side quests, Kinstones suck.
It's the worst thing that they could have added to the game. I'm sorry.
So they had a whole bunch of like side quests in mind, and I guess just didn't have enough rewards for those side quests. That's the only thing I can like explain the Kinstones, because too many of the rewards for side quests were Kinstones, which then you'd have to find an NPC to randomly be able to match them together to then have something else open up. And a lot of the times it would then just lead to more Kinstones.
Yeah. Well, and then good luck with the Kinstones because some of them are completely random which ones you get. So if you want to like 100% complete the game, you need to grind for Kinstones too. Like it's kind of obnoxious.
I don't know if I was just unlucky, but I basically never had green Kinstones.
I felt that way too. I don't know if green are rare or not, but that tracks with my experience. I can see what they were trying to do with it because it makes you go seek out characters throughout the world, right?
Yeah, forces interaction.
At that point, it's like the forced interaction means that you're not actually willing to interact with the world. If there were more like side quests where you get information and lore about characters and places all over the world, then that's something else. But seeing that icon appear over to people and you're just like, oh, I guess I have to talk to this person. It doesn't feel like it's the best way to make you interact.
I feel like Kinstone should have been a bit more generic, where you just need like X amount of green ones or X amount of red ones to like activate their side quest rather than this specific red one or this specific green one.
Yeah,
That way you don't have to like remember an entire game's worth of characters of which ones you've missed and which ones you've talked to.
Yeah. But other than that, I think most of the side quests were really fun, even if Kinstones were kind of obnoxious. Though I will say, if you really want 100% the game, good luck getting all of the figurines.
I didn't even try. I didn't even step foot into the shell shop.
From what I have read, it's not worth even trying. Like, I'm pretty sure there's like 100% Minish speedrun category that's like 100% no figurines or something like that. Just like in Wind Waker with its figurines. But I feel like Wind Waker's figurines was more fun because you got to take pictures of people and take them in. This one's like, good luck with our gacha.
Yeah. Is it possible to get soft locked out of 100%ing the game?
I don't know. That
because
is a good
you get to
question.
choose how many shells you use to buy the statues, right? And is there a limit to the amount of shells in the game? That'd be awful. Maybe you just have to grind like
Go
crazy.
cut down a ton of grass and just get one at a time. I honestly don't know. I didn't bother doing any more reading on that. I was like, I'm not going to do it, so no thanks. So anyway, lots of really fun design with the overworld. Some of the side quests are really rewarding and fun. It's just Kinstones absolutely suck. So that's our take, right?
Yeah. Levels were a bit of a mixed bag. Like I said, you can map like my enjoyment of the game based off of how many links you have for your 4-sword mechanic, and that's largely because the more links you have, the more the dungeons seem to be revolved around that mechanic.
Yeah.
The earlier dungeons were more revolved around the shrink mechanic, which I definitely enjoy a lot more than the 4-sword mechanic.
Right. And a lot more around the items that you get in the dungeon too.
Right. And also they were more puzzly than combat focused, whereas the later dungeons were very, very combat focused.
Right. And it makes you think that when dungeons are more combat focused than they are puzzle focused, that they were running low on development time because they couldn't, they didn't have time to make enough puzzles that really fit in with the new web or the new items that they were giving or making them interesting enough. So they just like, here's a harder enemy, I guess.
And like combat's fine. It's good to like,
right.
It's just that it was like room after room after room after room. And like some of the later, literally in the Dark Hyrule Castle, there's literally like a section of like 10 rooms in a row of just like knights that you have to fight over and over again.
At least sword fighting is actually kind of fun in this game. And you get really fun sword-based moves, right? Did you enjoy those at least?
I actually think as far as the 2D Zeldas go, this is my least favorite sword fighting game.
Oh, really? Even with all of those abilities and scrolls you find or whatever?
Yes, mostly because this game doesn't have like the concept of invincibility frames or
oh yeah, good point.
or proper hitboxes or hurt boxes. It's not uncommon for enemies to like overlap each other with their sprites, so they're basically just one blob of just death coming at you. Also, when enemies hit you, you don't have like this invincibility frame to then like reposition yourself. They can just hit you again and just like go infinitely into this. One instance I had, so I was fighting the second boss, the Cave of Flames boss, which is the dragon in the molten lake.
Yeah.
And there's a spot where he shot a fireball that continuously or just put fire on that space, right? And then he hit me into that fire space. And when you're on fire in this game, Link just starts running as fast as he can, right?
Yeah.
And I was facing directly into the molten lake. So my Link just immediately runs into the molten lake. Well, once you're in the molten lake, it has to spawn you a certain amount of spaces away from the molten lake. So it spawned me in the fireball to then do it again and again.
Yeah, that seems like an oversight.
It was an infinite loop that killed me. It was like, what on earth?
That's so dumb. Oh my gosh.
And there's so many instances through this game that are just like that, where you'll just get in like this bad position and then an enemy will just like infinite stun lock you until you're dead because there's just no ability to recover from the position. Well,
I will go ahead and revise my opinion. Now that you've brought that up, like, yeah, no, that actually does really suck. And even though I think some of the sword fighting can be fun and cool, it definitely is not as good as other 2D games. Because in A Link to the Past, even on the SNES, if you fell off the edge, you got like, 2 whole seconds of invincibility frames where you could move and nothing could hurt you?
Yeah.
And you were flashing. So why can't you do that in Minish Cap? That's not something that's hard to implement and feels like something you would just do in a 2D game like this.
Yeah, it was just a complete oversight.
Well, that's dumb.
My favorite was when the final boss or whatever, you have to like shrink, and there's like the specific pad that you have to stand on to shrink to go fight the final boss or whatever. As soon as I maneuvered around the boss, got onto the pad got near the pad to grow large again, and the boss maneuvered himself to be right below the pad. As soon as you get large again, Link jumps off forward and he jumped straight into the boss and couldn't go backwards because that's where the pad was, and it just like infinite killed me. It was so It was so frustrating because of how long it takes to get to the final boss.
Yeah, that's obnoxious. Another reason why I quit in Dark Hyrule Castle. But I mean, I guess talking about some of the individual dungeons, I will say, like, I am very surprised at how, like, well designed Deepwood Shrine is. I think that it's actually a really good first dungeon.
Yeah, it's a really, really well designed first dungeon. It has a pretty fun core mechanic with like rolling the centerpiece of the dungeon, which is the barrel.
Right.
Really good design to have all paths like kind of spider web their way around out and back towards that room when you can progress further. And then you have to like do a new thing to the barrel to like move it to be able to move on to the next section.
Yeah.
I thought that's a pretty well designed dungeon, in my opinion.
I agree. And I feel like the vibes are great. And the final boss is really fun, that it's just a regular choo-choo that you have to fight while you're tiny. And you have to like suck up its goop on its legs and make it fall over. I thought that was honestly just such a fun dungeon.
Yeah, it was a really creative idea.
And it does so much with the few items and abilities you have at the very beginning of the game. And I just think it works so well.
Yeah.
Honestly, probably one of my favorite first dungeons in the series. Though I haven't ever ranked all of them, so maybe it's actually pretty low. I don't know.
I'm trying to think off the top of my head. So just first dungeons, right?
Yeah, just first dungeons. I've always thought Twilight Princess's first dungeon was pretty good.
Yeah. I mean, it takes 2 hours to get there, but yeah.
Yeah. Skyward Sword's first dungeon is okay. It does have that one central room. The real question is if in Wind Waker you count Forsaken Fortress as your first dungeon.
Forsaken Fortress is the first dungeon. I think that's my favorite.
It's really good because it's got the stealth mechanics and you're completely stripped of the sword that you worked so hard to get.
Yeah.
I think that's very fun. What was the first dungeon in A Link to the Past? I'm just blanking on the whole progression of that game. I mean, technically it's Hyrule Castle, right? Or at least the sewers of Hyrule Castle.
Yeah, I think this is a bit better than that.
Yeah, I agree. But, we don't have to sit and talk about all the first dungeons. I just think that Minish Caps fits in really well and teaches you how the game works really right off the bat.
Yeah, and it also, like, a lot of the dungeons, especially the early on dungeons, Capcom really put a lot of effort in making sure that despite this being a 2D Zelda game, there's a lot of verticality to these dungeons.
Yes.
And
yes.
A lot of the rooms interact with each other.
Yes. Right. Like, I also really love Cave of Flames, the second dungeon. I think that the cart mechanic, where you zoom through and they make really fun looking animations of Link, like holding on for dear life. Like, that's a very fun way to design a dungeon. I don't think we've had crazy minecarts like that ever again.
No, nothing at that speed. We had minecarts in Breath of the Wild, but
yeah, we did. But those are they're not focuses of dungeons. They're just part of that overworld exploration and solving some Korok puzzles. And I guess it's part of like getting to a particular shrine on a side quest.
And to make flying machines.
Right, because if you stack one on top of the other, you can use magnesis on the one underneath and fly. That game is so fun. I'm so excited for Tears of the Kingdom. But yeah, besides Dark Hyrule Castle, though, I will say the most frustrating dungeon is Palace of Winds. Why don't you share your experience on Palace of Winds, Jordan?
Oh, Palace of Winds. So I like the idea that they had for it. It kind of breaks the convention of all the dungeons up to that point that I just praised them for, which is that there's kind of like the central room that everything kind of like spiderwebs around and then like interacts with each other. And there's a lot of verticality and all that. Palace of Winds is like a very long linear platforming. It's a platformer, right?
It's a platformer, but in basically one dimension. It's all about where you are.
Yeah,
vertically and horizontally on
technically the screen. Verticality to it because you are trying to climb up the palace, especially for the first half. But it is so long. The first half is basically the length of a normal dungeon with no warp points. If you like fall or die, which I had the unfortunate experience of doing, it takes you back to the beginning of the dungeon and you have to do it all over again. It's like a boss walk that makes Dark Souls jealous. It's
yeah. I think that's its biggest flaw. I think it's such a cool idea, and atmospherically it's such a cool dungeon design. And it's really cool because you had like the Fortress of Winds, right? That was the fake out. And so you had to go to Palace of Winds. And it's fun. They don't really do a ton of fake outs when it comes to like key items that you need in Zelda games as much. So it's a welcome surprise and works really well. But I do agree that the design, or maybe not the design, but the way that the gameplay interacts with the design is honestly pretty horrid.
Yeah. And then when you get to finally the first like warp points, like, oh man, that was just the first half. Yeah. And then they decide to make it into a dark dungeon where one of your item slots is just constantly taken up by the stupid lantern.
Well, there weren't lights in ancient times, Jordan.
They had whale oil.
All in all, I think that the level design and dungeons are pretty solid, besides like the last couple of dungeons. That's kind of my takeaway.
Specifically just the last two, because I did like the fourth dungeon, the Temple of Droplets.
Yeah, Temple of Droplets is good. I think they do ice physics really well in that dungeon.
Yeah, and especially since a lot of that dungeon was like rooms interacting with each other, because you have to try and get the light down to the lower levels so that you can melt ice blocks and stuff.
Yes, exactly.
I feel like Temple of Droplets is where their creativity kind of ended.
Yeah, which is a shame because those first four dungeons, Deepwood Shrine, Cave of Flames, Fortress of Winds, and Temple of Droplets are really quite solid 2D Zelda dungeons.
Yeah.
I like most of them more than I like most of the dungeons in like Link's Awakening and the Oracle games. Probably definitely more than Oracle. But
there's some of the best 2D Zelda dungeons in the series.
Yeah, I agree.
On par with Link to the Past and The Link Between Worlds, in my opinion.
I agree. But now, we've already talked a little bit about some of the bosses and enemies, and especially when we talked about some of the mechanics of sword fighting, right? And how awful that is. Were there any other major moments in the game, enemy or boss-wise, that you particularly enjoyed or absolutely hated?
I absolutely hated the Palace of Winds boss. Oh, man. So like that was one where you have to like jump between the manta rays or whatever that are flying in the sky. And thematically, it's one of the best bosses ever, right? Like
it's so cool.
The theme of it is so amazing and fun. It's just that once they are like, all right, now you have to dodge all these flying missiles whilst charging your four swords blade to then walk across to like hit the three eyes. It's like, this is where they started using the four sword mechanic as combat.
Yep.
And there's just too much going on for it to be enjoyable. Like it's not super hard. It's just frustrating.
See, what I want to know is why the heck are there four sword standing plates on the monster? Like, how did it get those? I don't think the game ever tells you, right?
They're just there.
They're just there.
Yeah. And they could have still done like fun things even without like the four swords. Like maybe you have to put a bomb on one eye and then slash the other eye or something.
Yeah, that would work. Because you do have the remote bombs in the game. So could have used those.
Yeah, probably shouldn't design it to like require you to use remote bombs specifically though. But having remote bombs so that it's easier would definitely be good.
Right.
Oh man, there was just so many like things in that fight that were trying to push you off the manta ray to deal damage. And it wasn't ever clear on like a first run of where you were supposed to go next, because then like a manta ray would start like descending or whatever, and if you stay on it, then you fall down to your death. And so you have to just like know where the other manta ray is going to show up,
right?
And jump onto them.
Yeah. What really frustrates me is they are officially named Georgs, and Georg is the name of the fish boss from Majora's Mask. So what's the connection here, guys? Is it a fish or is it a giant flying manta ray?
I always thought they were kind of like similar in nature to the Mulgara from Wind Waker.
Yeah. They look much more like the Mulgara for sure. But anyway, I just think they're funny. I already talked about the big green choo-choo. I think he's a really great boss. I think that the ancient statue is a really cool design. You know, the boss of the Fortress of Winds really brings those Wind Waker vibes back in.
Yeah, always got to have an Andross somewhere in a Nintendo game.
Yeah, exactly. But other than that, I think that most of the enemies are pretty standard. And you already mentioned about the Gibdos and having to light those suckers on fire and how obnoxious and annoying that is.
They have way too much health on them.
Yeah. But pretty much every other enemy is fairly standard Zelda stuff, you know, pulled from other enemies in the game.
Yeah.
I will say, though, that Vati's final form looks a lot like a Kirby villain.
Yeah, it does.
So I don't know if Capcom meant to do that on purpose or not, because we already had Kirby 64 released at this point. Plus, like, Nightmare in Dreamland was already on Game Boy Advance. So
Nintendo just hates giant black balls with eyes on them.
And arms.
They're the true villains.
Yeah. But I think Vati's a cool villain. His motivations, I think, are a little weird in this game, and they kind of explain it better in Four Swords Adventures, where he's just actually evil. Because he starts off being like, I'm trying to help everybody. And then later's like, but just kidding, he's actually evil. I mean, it's a 2D Zelda game. It's not typically known for its super strong story and amazing character development. But considering Eslo is a really fun character to get to know, I wish that Vati had a little bit of a deeper motivation behind his evilness.
So, like, did he free Zelda just for the fun of it? Because he had like no reason to do that. Because he didn't even know that she was the source of light until the cutscene after you hit the fourth sword.
Yeah, I don't know.
And he's like, oh, I'm glad I didn't like kill her or anything. I guess I'll go.
Exactly. I don't know why he did that. He probably just did that because they needed a reason for Link to go and deal with things, because Zelda is Link's childhood friend. And how dare we have Zelda follow us along as a companion? Just kidding. They did that in Spirit Tracks, and it worked really well.
Yeah.
Anyway, I guess kind of moving on then. How did you enjoy like the graphics and sound? I think that they're very Game Boy Advance-y, but I think they're also very good. I think that the sprite artwork is phenomenal, and I already mentioned that the set pieces look really great. There's a lot of movement. Everything looks really lifelike and realistic. And I like how they managed to transpose the Wind Waker art style into sprites. I don't know if your opinion's the same or not, though.
No, I think the sprite work is phenomenal. It does definitely feel like it's a product of its era, but it's like the best of its era at the same time, right?
Yeah.
It doesn't feel like one of those games that's trying to. So like a lot of games nowadays are like, oh, this is supposed to feel like a GBA game or something, but then it doesn't actually feel like a GBA game. It just captures that essence. Like this still has the essence of a GBA game.
Yeah.
It definitely feels like a GBA game because it is, but so it doesn't feel as polished as a lot of the retro look backs that a lot of indie games have. But right. Compared amongst its peers, it's really, really good in terms of graphics, I feel.
I totally agree. And I think it looks so much better than like Pokemon ever did on the Game Boy Advance.
I will say Emerald is very iconic for me.
It's super iconic. You know, the sprites are definitely up there. I love those games to death. It's, you know, I'll always remember what they look like. But Minish Cap, they just did a really good job with the art for sure.
Yeah.
And I think the sound design is really solid as well. Music's pretty good. I don't really have any complaints in that department. And it's really kind of fun hearing Game Boy version or Game Boy Advance versions of the Majora's Mask and Wind Waker sound effects.
So I will admit, I didn't play with much of the sound on.
Oh, well, there you go.
Mostly because as soon as I got to like low health in one fight, and the beeping came on, I was like, well, that's off.
I'm not
listening to that ever again.
Yeah. Another product of its time. When you're low on health, the game has to remind you constantly that you're about to die.
Yeah. And not only that,
changing Link's animations.
Probably the most annoying beeping in the entire franchise.
Yeah. It really is. It's a Game Boy Advance game, and Game Boy Advance games were designed to be played without sound too, because a lot of kids couldn't. You know, they'd play it handheld while their families were watching TV or in the car ride or whatever. Sound was, I think sound was an important part of the game design back then, but it also like wasn't really seen as a necessity because not everyone was going to be able to use it. Plus, headphones sucked for some of the Game Boy Advance consoles. Like the regular Game Boy Advance without the backlight, I believe it did have an aux port, right? But I had a Game Boy Advance SP, and the Game Boy Advance SP did not have an aux port. You had to buy like a stupidly weird adapter that would plug into the power slot in the back. It was so weird.
Okay, yeah. I had a standard Game Boy Advance, so I had an aux port.
Well, you're cool.
Yeah. It allowed me to have my ears get blown off by Ridley in Metroid Fusion.
Right, because they did not adjust that at all. But anyway, I guess we can kind of start wrapping things up by talking about our overall impressions of the game. I mean, we've talked a lot about various things that we've enjoyed and that we've hated, or that we think are just haven't aged as well. While I do think the final two temples had some good ideas, they definitely kind of pull down the whole experience for me. I still think that Minish Cap is a super solid game. And if you have NSO, you should definitely give it a try, especially if you're somewhat new to the Zelda franchise or you've never played some of the older 2D games. You know, it's available. You might as well give it a shot. The game is beautiful. I think that it controls fairly well, besides some of the quirks we talked about earlier. And I really like the direction that they took a lot of parts of the game. I think that Vaati is one of the funnest side characters to have. I still prefer some of the 3D sidekicks to Vaati, or sorry, not Vaati. I meant Eslo. Excuse me. Said that backwards. But I think it's totally solid when it comes to standing among its Zelda peers. I will say, though, that my favorite 2D Zelda game is still between A Link to the Past and A Link Between Worlds. I think that those games just did 2D better when it came to consistent design and consistent fun across the board. But Minish Cap is definitely a really solid entry, and I highly recommend it.
Yeah, overall, I like the game. And if you haven't played through it, I would recommend playing it. I would also say if you get frustrated in the last two dungeons, don't feel bad to just drop it.
Yeah, we both did. Well, you went back to it and actually did finish it.
Yeah,
I dropped it.
I had to take a week break because it was just, I was getting, I haven't gotten that angry from a Zelda game in quite some time. I'll say, wow. I think it was probably my playthrough of Wand of Gamelon that like matched the same level of just frustration.
Well, but Wand of Gamelon was bad all around, so
yeah,
you suffered that whole game. In this one, you just suffer at the end.
I will say though, if you play it on the Nintendo Switch Online, you do have effectively save states and a rewind option.
Yes.
So if you are concerned about those last two dungeons and don't want to stop through, you do have those as options as well.
Yeah, make a save state every room you enter.
Yeah. Or if you're as stubborn as I am, you can just take a week break and vent a bit before returning.
Scrape into the void and then come back to it. But overall, you thought it was a fun game, at least at the beginning.
Yeah, overall, like right now, because it's so fresh in my mind, it's just the ending. Like I said, I'm a bit soured on it, but putting that aside, overall, I did enjoy it.
Good. And I think looking back on this game makes me more interested in where the series is going to go. I mean, we've talked about this before, and I don't want to spend a lot of time on it, but I really do hope that we get another 2D Zelda game in the near future. I know they've been really focused on a couple of the like remakes, even though they're not really all remakes. Skyward Sword was definitely an HDification, and but Link's Awakening on the Switch was a remake. I hope that we get a new, fresh 2D Zelda experience, kind of like how Minish Cap was in its time. I think that the 2D Zelda design space has a lot to offer still. I think that A Link Between Worlds is one of the best games on the 3DS, period. And I'm just still really, really excited for Tears of the Kingdom because they wanted to add some elements from Minish Cap to Breath of the Wild, like adding the Minish. Maybe we'll actually see the Minish in Tears of the Kingdom.
Yeah, I would be pretty excited to see Minish return. I don't know if Tears of the Kingdom is the appropriate place for them to return, because there seems to already be a lot of mechanics being thrown into that game. And to do the
But Jordan, it's a $70 game. That's why it's $70. They're adding the Minish.
It's $70 because they don't want to be perceived as a lesser value than
yes.
than Xbox and Sony. Let's be real. It's all just like it's just a perception thing. But as far as like 2D Zeldas, I would be over the moon for more 2D Zelda games. It's been a while since we've seen anything from Grezzo. Just have Grezzo do it.
Yeah. What have they been doing?
Yeah. the core Zelda team is busy with like the 3D Zelda games, and that's like the main course that I want to keep being produced. I would like more Zelda games, but I don't feel like you need like the core Zelda team to really do it, as like, well, yeah, as Minish Cap shown, like other teams can handle Zelda pretty well. Give it to Grezzo.
Yeah. Actually, I know what Grezzo was doing. They did Link's Awakening in 2019, but apparently they also handled the Miitopia port to Switch. Grezzo has shown that they can do a really good job with the Zelda series. So
yeah, they did the Triforce Heroes, right?
Yes, they did.
So they have made like a new game from scratch before.
Yes.
It's not, they're not just a port house.
They also made Ever Oasis. I had forgotten about that game. I mean, I never played it, but definitely heard of it.
Neither have I. But yeah, I would like to see Zelda 2D Zelda to return, especially since Link Between Worlds was so good.
Yeah, it was a phenomenal game.
Like when it came out, I was really excited because I thought that meant that we were going to start getting some more high quality 2D Zelda games. And then we never did. It's been 10 years.
Right. Has it really been 10 years?
It has. It came out in 2013, if I remember right, off the top of my head.
I hate that. Jordan, I hate you. It came out November 22nd, 2013. It's almost been 10 years. Okay,
yeah,
give us more 2D Zeldas.
I believe the same day as 3D World.
I don't remember, but
I remember picking up both at the same day at midnight release.
It's weird of Nintendo doing a double release.
Right?
They don't do that anymore.
Yeah, and like Pokemon was like the week before or after or something. Like Nintendo did. It was not.
Well, that was 2013. They needed to get stuff out because they had nothing for the Wii U.
Yeah, it seemed like Nintendo did not coordinate with itself very well during that month.
No. But anyway, I do agree with you. I hope we get to see more 2D Zelda games. Playing Minish Cap was really fun. Again, took me back to when I was in middle school or high school, whenever it was I played it the first time. And yeah, I just think that there are a lot of good lessons to be learned from that game, and hopefully we get some new stuff very soon. I mean, we get Tears of the Kingdom very soon, but I'd love to see 2D Zelda, is what I mean. So anyway, any other final thoughts here, Jordan, about the Minish Cap?
I think I'm good.
All right. Well, thanks for chatting about it with me. I've had a lot of fun. It's like good hearing about your pain and suffering during the last chunk of the game.
Yeah. Yeah. Oh man, dark Hyrule Castle, man.
Anyway, with all that said, thank you so much for listening to this episode of the NintenFusion podcast. We sure appreciate you. Those of you that have stuck it around to listen to our Minish Cap discussion here. If you want to talk with us about any sort of Nintendo games or topic, head over to our Discord server by going to nintenfusion.com/Discord. That'll give you an invite, and we can chat about stuff there. Of course, please be sure to leave a like, review, comment on whatever platform you're listening to us on. It'll help us out a lot and help us grow the show. But with all that said, thank you again for listening, and we'll catch you on the next one. Bye-bye.
See ya.